So, since I arrived at FCPS and have been the liaison to this committee, the policy committee minutes have been uploaded into board docs as essentially a text, just loaded directly into board docs. They are not a standalone document. We have been, as a system, undergoing a series of audits by different entities, one of them being the Office of Legislative Audits. It's a regular event. It's not a special or significant.
Every 4 years or so.
Significant. It comes every 4 to 6 years, something like that. And one of the questions that the Office of Legislative Audits asked was about the minutes that we create for the ethics panel. And that got me thinking, because it made me realize that we don't have a formal minutes document for the policy committee, and if we were to ever be audited on these minutes, we would have to go into board docs and pull them out every time we need the minutes, because that's where they are officially housed. So in response to the OLA's inquiry, I came up with this template that will look more like a formal set of minutes, and it's an actual document that we would be able to share. It can be loaded into board docs. It can be loaded to our website if we want to store it on our website and just make it publicly available in another way. If you don't like it, you don't have to use it. If you like it and you want to do both, we can do both. Or if you just want to use this, we can do this. It's completely up to you. So what my team did is we prepared the September 25th meeting minutes in this form, so you would effectively approve this template and then approve the minutes in this template. And we will keep it, we will change it, we'll do whatever you would like us to do with it. We just felt that as a team, having a more formalized set of minutes that are more official, that have our, the policy committee heading at the top, would benefit us in the future as we move towards trying to create a more unified system and in terms of how our policies are generated. And this is the same header that we use for the policies, so it will align with that. So that's kind of the how we got here and why you see a surprise agenda item.
I love it. And
Yeah.
I mean,
I was going to say stop.
Yeah.
You had me at hello.
I really
I love
appreciate
it. I love it.
the action at the bottom of each item,
Yep.
so that we know it's particularly clear what we determined as a committee, where each item on the agenda is going. So if we forget exactly what we decided, when something's decided to come back, or what we were planning to do in terms of that, it's called out. So I think it's great.
Yeah, I like it. I think it's an easier read. I think it's more succinct with, like you said, the other format and the templates that we're using for policy. And I just noted here, this note, it says the meeting was recorded, which I really like, in that how people are in attendance. So I think that's a really good addition.
I just have a comment and a question. One, I love it. I think it'll be much more readable if any member of the public would happen to want to review the minutes. It's so concise. My question is, how quickly will the minutes be up?
So we had some conversations with Ms. Rich about that. We have a commitment to make sure that those minutes are available and posted within 2 weeks after the meeting is held.
Okay.
That gives my team time to prepare the minutes, gives me time to review to make sure they're consistent with my notes, and then get them to Ms. Rich so she's able to upload them to board docs.
Great. Thank you.
This is amazing. So I'm madly typing during these meetings because I keep a document for myself between here and the CAC. And so now when I tell them, hey, look at the minutes, they can really see every single, I cannot thank you enough for this. And I think it translates everything that we do so well to the public to be able to understand, oh, okay, this is an actionable item, or this was discussion. Why was this for discussion? Who came, and I think it is fantastic, and I love how it just makes all the information more accessible to everybody, not just people that are here every month. So yeah, thank you.
Are we the only committee that will be doing it in this format, or are you proposing that this is across the board?
I am only the liaison to this committee. I will also apply a similar template to the ethics panel, which I also support. It's certainly, I'm happy to share the template with my colleagues who work on the other committees, and if they want to adopt them, they are free to do so. I mean, they're your committees, so.
I might mention it in my comments tonight with
Yeah.
the policy update and suggest that other board members take a look at the template
I agree.
so that they.
It would be great to be
I
consistent
think-
across all
right, I
committees.
think uniformity is.
It'd be great.
Yeah, I agree.
It's really well done.
Yeah.
I make a motion that we accept the template.
Do you want to replace the text-based or do both?
I don't think.
I think replace. So I'll make a motion that we accept the template and replace the template.
So they actually then will just be an attachment
Yep.
as a,
It will get uploaded to Board Docs as an attachment, and then we can also create a separate warehouse on the board's policy page. We can ask our IT team to create a warehouse, so to make it a little easier for the public to access, because getting into Board Docs, navigating around, if you're used to it and you've done it, easy peasy. If you're not used to getting in there, it can be a challenge.
it's time consuming to
Yep.
find something.
So let's do,
Yeah.
our vote. All those in favor
Who
of
seconded?
Nancy did.
Nancy.
All those in favor? All of our policy committee members. Awesome, thank you so much for that.
Now you have the minutes to
We
approve.
have the minutes to approve, both in our new template and our old template. So approval of our September 25th Policy Committee meeting minutes. Do I have a motion for approval? Motion to approve.
Second.
All those in favor? It's also unanimous. 1.04, public comment. We do not appear to have any public present with us, so we will move on to 1.05, policy 446, student suicide prevention and safety training, which has been renamed, and many updates to that.
So while our guests are coming to the table, I know that we also had policy 418 back in August. You had asked about it in September, and I said, well, we'll have it in October. We're still taking a look at it. We think there's still some more work to be done, and we want to make sure that it is a strong, clean policy before we present to the policy committee. So we're hoping that it will be ready for the next policy committee meeting. So, policy 446, formerly student suicide prevention and safety training, now just student suicide prevention, if it is adopted as amended. This was previously before the policy committee on August 28th for just information and discussion to understand the board's interests. It was originally adopted on August 28th of 2019, so it's been about 5 years since this has last been looked at, not too long of a time. The discussion in August was about including the implementation responsibilities of staff to report, adding definitions, including the COMAR student suicide prevention safety training requirements, looking at our compliance module to expand beyond certificated employees, and to expand to include prevention efforts and beyond just training content. And so the proposed edits, as RU said, a fairly significant overhaul. This has been a lot of work, and Dana Falls and Janet Shipman are here to help support the conversation. And they did the lion's share of the work with Ms. Chesney from my team to get this in the position it's in. And so I'll actually turn it over to them and let them talk through what the changes they're proposing are.
Good morning.
Good morning.
So obviously, the old policy was nothing but a shell. And so really appreciated the recommendation to kind of expand it. And so what we did was we just kind of went through all of the definitions and included those that we include not only in regulation or in the description of, our process, but also in the training that we provide to the staff and coaches and volunteers. So, all of these definitions are obviously additions because they weren't included in the previous policy. And if you need me to slow down and go over all the details, I can, but
I think we discussed most of the details last time, so I think giving that overview is good.
I will add that when we're doing the definitions, and this is really more of a reminder than an addition, we try and make sure we're being consistent across our policies. So some of the definitions you'll see here, parent, school property, or school grounds, those are, our goal is to make sure that those are consistent across all of the policies, and you'll see the same definitions appear elsewhere.
and then the policy statement was kind of taken from, what was previously there, but really outlining the board's, goal of and focus on the well-being of our students and the safety of our students. And then the law states that, certificated personnel must receive the training, but FCPS, we really think it's important that anybody working with our kids receive the training. So the coaches, the volunteers, anybody that's going to be working one-on-one that a student may develop a relationship with, and that student may have, a sense of trust and safety, and they disclose that, they're contemplating suicide or having suicidal ideation, then that staff member knows what to do and, how to proceed.
Let me ask a question about the training. Is the training available in languages other than English?
Not currently. We are working on it. This training was always done for staff, but we sort of rallied around last year and talked about these gaps around volunteers and coaches. So we modified that training for those groups, and they go into the same system and get training. But we actually just had a meeting, I don't know, maybe about a month ago, talk about some needs for, we're getting requests, particularly from our parent volunteers, around the translation. So it's it's just taking us some time to do it, but it's in the works.
I think that's true of a lot of our training.
Yes, right, exactly.
Yeah, we've had similar requests for other trainings as well.
So then, on to implementation. The professional development and training, that is all directly from COMAR. So those are the requirements of that training by law. And then the reporting process, and this was stated very vaguely in the previous policy or the original policy, in that if a student discloses, whether it's verbally, whether it's in, a journal or a paper they're writing in their English class, or whether it's a statement to somebody else on social media that's then brought to attention, any of our staff members or, soon to be our coaches, volunteers, once they know that, their guidance is to report that to an administrator and a mental health provider within the building. Used to be the counselor, but we're blessed with all those additional positions now, and more counselors. So it's just, they need to make sure somebody else knows. We have counselors that find out in the evening and they get their information and they call parents immediately, regardless of when it is. 988 is the hotline number. And so all of our school counselors have it on their signature page so that it's out there a lot for the public. I think it's a great addition to have it in the policy. And it again is, outlined as a requirement as much as possible to be out there. And we have it up in schools. The counselors have information in their offices.
The one additional change that I will note that we have not made yet, that we need to make, is just a tiny one. And that is the regulation that corresponds is 400-63. It will be renumbered to 44601 to align with the policy it supports.
Any other questions?
Good catch.
So does that regulation still stand, though, the 400-63, or is that changing too?
That is also going to be under review, and it will be revised and submitted to the RRC, the Regulation Review Committee, for an update to be made, and at that time, that's when we'll update the number.
Okay.
So anytime that we are revising a policy to this extent, it's important we look at the regulation and make sure that the reg is aligned now with the new policy.
Yeah. I just didn't know if the number was gonna stay the same.
It will for now. There's no, it's not worth it to change it and then have to change it, the rest of it. You know, it can live the way it is until that comes. And what we try and generally do is time the work of the RRC to match when the policy will be ready for approval. So we have a little bit of time to make that change. We use kind of the cue we get from the policy committee. If the policy is approved to go to the board, that signals to staff that we can start updating the regulation. There won't be, we don't anticipate significant changes coming back to us from there. Although I do understand from Ms. Chesney that it is ready for or will be ready for the RRC in November. So it will be coming soon.
I don't have any other questions or comments. Thank you so much for the work that you put into.
Janet and Ryan deserve the credit for that.
I just had one quick question about, on 3A, it says where applicable, 988 will be included on a student's ID card. Is that high schooler's ID card?
Yeah, and that was the goal previously. And then it seems like I read somewhere recently that it's not, like, because it used to be required. And so different school systems were working with the photo companies, you know, that were doing the pictures. Now, since our middle schoolers also have IDs, we could look into, but we don't currently have that number on their IDs.
I mean, I like that idea, having it on the back of their ID. It just says.
Yeah, it is a good reminder.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, when I saw that in there, I really liked that, so I would strongly suggest we pursue that, to get that on the back of their ID cards.
So do you want where applicable, or do you want it to say that it'll be on the back of ID cards?
I would like it.
That would live in the reg, because the policy is more of like the.
No, I like what you said on here. I strongly encourage the regulation require it, that we put it on the back of our ID cards.
It may actually be required by law. We'll verify that, but I think there is a provision in the education code that requires it for 6th through 12th.
Great. Thank you.
Great.
Great.
Thank
Thank you very much. So it sounds like we're ready to move this along to the full board for first reading. Excellent.
You have somebody between us, right?
Yes.
I'm sorry.
You're welcome to stay at the table, though. You don't have to.
Thanks.
So the next one, 1.06, Policy 319, Administrative Management and Technical AMT Group, which will be renamed as the Non-Unit Employee Group. This was last updated in February of 2024, and we understand that this is a bit out of order and a bit more, coming back to the policy committee a bit more quickly than we usually do, but the need was urgent. And after we adopted the changes, or after the board adopted the changes back in February, as we went through the budgeting process, we came to a realization that we needed to make some additional changes to the policy. In part to align with the needs and expectations of the system with respect to compensation for those individuals who are not included in a bargaining unit, and also to make sure that we are aligned with what the law requires of us in determining who is in a bargaining unit and who is not in a bargaining unit. So I'm going to turn the floor over to Dr. Sergo, because this was really her and Julie Nguyen's efforts.
Yeah, so sort of understanding Policy 319 has been really interesting to me, because having been in another school system, this was actually not, this was sort of a new construct that I inherited when I came here to Frederick County. So the education article is really clear that the overwhelming majority of all employees in a public school system should be in a bargaining unit. We're a collective bargaining state, everyone is supposed to be in a unit. So they're very strict about who essentially is not in a labor unit. And historically, that was sort of a broad determination. School superintendents and their boards could sort of elect among all these people, whether they were certificated or not, who they would pull out. But the law is actually really narrow in this regard. And right after we had this meeting, probably like a week later, we went to a briefing with some of the attorneys that sort of manage labor for the state around this particular aspect of the law, around what's called the confidential employee. So arguably, the law says, education article says, that the only people not in a unit, the only people who should not be in a labor unit, are people who are confidential employees. And so you start to dig into that a little bit and you think it's a very narrow definition. A confidential employee is essentially anyone who is serving on the board's bargaining team. That because of the posture of knowing the board's interests and needing to negotiate, you have to be sort of outside of a labor unit because you can't bargain against yourself or for yourself. And that's a really hard spot for school systems to be in because that's a very small number of people. I mean, arguably, we have sort of a bench, if you will, by job type. Often it's our directors, our cabinet members, those folks who are serving on those groups. But it could change year to year. Maybe one year I ask Mr. Falls to do it, maybe another year he doesn't. And so the idea of him coming in and out of a unit sort of doesn't work really well. So historically, you know, that's sort of how, but in Frederick, it was a very broad category of employees, and it was almost over-applied to be pretty much anyone in central office. You could be an executive assistant, you could be of any sort of job type. And there are, just to be clear, about 124 individuals in this group currently. So we really looked at that, and it was very easy for us to figure out, well, who are the confidential employees? It's pretty much anyone who's on exec staff, directors and above. They clearly, by nature of what they do, they need to work with the board, have bargaining postures, they're confidential. But there's this other group, and this is where it becomes really interesting, of what we call non-supervisory, non-certificated staff. So keep in mind two things that you need to know. The FACE, our support professional unit, their charter is for non-supervisory support professionals. So if you have any supervisory capacity, you're not supposed to be in FACE. So we do have a couple of things we have to tend to there, I will say. We have some supervisors in FACE we've got to relocate. But non-supervisory, non-supervisory support professionals are in there. And if you go on the NEA's website, they tell you the 9 job categories that they focus on, but it's what you would expect: clerical, maintenance, custodial, things of that nature. If you are a certificated employee, you're in our teacher unit. Okay, so it's teachers of all types, and that they also include non-teacher positions, might be, I think, social workers, speech pathologists, there are some others, but certificated. If you are certificated and supervisory, you're in our administrative unit. Now, interestingly, the administrative unit isn't limited to certificated individuals. And we've been talking with them, but in many school systems, if you are supervisory, you'll be on one part of the administrator unit, and if you're and have a certificate, and if you're supervisory but you don't have a certificate, you can also be there. It's like a business and operations sort of arm. Again, all still have to be supervisory. So that accounts for like 99.9% of our employees. So again, we're left with this 124 people. Good chunk we know already have to stay. Well, we were left with about 24, I think it was 24 people who are not supervisory and not certificated. They're essential to the operation of our school system. We're talking about our accountants, some of the things of that nature. So they don't belong in a unit, but they're not confidential employees because they may not necessarily sit on bargaining. And so Mr. Blivis and I had extensive conversations, talked with other legal counsels, looked at COMAR, and essentially there's this space inside of people that we can also exclude from a unit, not just confidential employees, but what we call the managerial employee. Now you hear manager and you think supervisor. Well, not necessarily. The language of the managerial and executive employee is essentially anyone whose roles are sort of they've sort of unfettered access to important and confidential information, even if they're not sitting on bargaining, that are essential to the operation of our system.
IT.
Right? IT would be a great example.
So the statute defines managerial employee the way we've defined it in the policy.
Correct.
An individual who is engaged mainly in executive and managerial functions. What the law does not do is define what it means to engage in executive and managerial functions.
Right.
There's no definition. And this is just, there's nothing out there. We searched, we did not find anything that really provides specific guidance as to what that means. So that left us the ability to do what Dr. Sergo said and said, we defined it for ourselves. And we defined it broad enough that it meets what we think are the qualifying criteria, while at the same time applying to the individuals that we are, or the positions, not the individuals, to the positions that kind of fell into that gap.
So we thought this was really important to call out not only who's in this group, but why they're there, and there really was no clarity about that previously. And I will share with you that there, particularly over the last year, there were some individuals who had come to me, particularly after the budget had been adopted and, you know, all of the labor agreements were signed, and this group didn't necessarily get, you know, if it was bargained for a group, a labor group, it didn't necessarily get applied to this group. And they felt like, well, why wasn't I included? You know, I'm a certificated person, or I have a supervisory responsibility. And so we were finding more and more people who felt like, why am I in this group? You know, do I belong here? I feel like I'm being held from benefits of membership unnecessarily. So that's sort of why, number one, we're renaming it as the non-unit employee group. Be very clear, these are people not in a unit, and who would sort of be in that unit. Secondary to that, so that's sort of what you see, and we removed pretty much all the language that was sort of a wide, you know, stroke of all the reasons you might have someone there. The other piece of this has to do with salary and compensation. So this is an interesting part of this particular policy. This policy doesn't say anything unusual, which is that if you don't have a bargaining unit, these individuals in this group aren't signing anything with the board. You know, it basically says the superintendent is given a portion of the salary resource pool, and they can determine how they will utilize that for this group. Pretty much from all what we can tell over many, many years, whatever was negotiated with the units was applied here. Well, I think that might have worked, sort of generally speaking, from a salary resource pool perspective for many years. You know, people were getting 3%, 4%, whatever that adjustment is. But more and more over the last few years, particularly with Blueprint, our units are negotiating, as the board knows, sort of what I call salary supplements. Things like longevity, things like national board certification, things like, I'm trying to think of some other supplements and stipends, just a variety of things that you all have seen that you've agreed to. But this group doesn't, doctoral degree, whatever it is. This group really was getting those things, but it didn't really explain why they would or wouldn't get it over time. This now narrows that and says, listen, superintendent's going to be given a portion of the salary resource pool, and they'll decide how to use it. They may give you the same, they may give you different, but this is not an automatic. You don't automatically get to piggyback on what's happening in other groups. So that's sort of, that clarifies this. And it calls it out very specifically in 3C, that whatever's negotiated by the units, there should be no assumption that it's going to apply to this group, and that's an important distinction. It also talks about, if you go on to item 4, this idea of benefits. This was a really interesting one. So benefits is specific to the idea of how you accrue leave, and what I call terminal pay sort of things, how we pay out things when you leave or you separate from service. And there was some very weird, maybe that's not a fair word, there was some unusual practices around giving members of this group different benefits based on their job type. So if you think of our salary scale as having, you know, grades, right? Levels of complexity, levels of a span of control, all the way from a grade 1 up through, a grade 10, I'm making that up, grade 10 for the purposes of this example. People who were less than a certain grade, they got to piggyback on the FACE benefits, which some might argue were less generous. And if you were higher than that, you got to piggyback on the FACASA benefits. So even in this group, they didn't have a uniform benefit structure. Some had different benefits than others. We're recommending that this group completely piggyback on the FACASA benefits. It's the most consistent benefits. It's what's already consistent. The overwhelming majority of people in this group have identical benefits to that. So if you use that as a measure, that has to do with your insurance rates. It has to do with all of those leave accruals. Let's just sort of split the difference and say almost everyone with few exception should be here. It doesn't matter what your job is. If you're in a non-unit group, you should have the same kinds of benefits. And then the last piece is just sort of striking language that was unnecessary because of the work that the board has done with Policy 300 about sort of how we deal with discipline and dismissal. So that's sort of a high-level summary of what generated these changes, and we are open to questions and thoughts from the board.
The one other thing I would add before we get to
Sure.
questions, if you go back up to 3A, you'll see that we added or salary structure. So it's a non-union employee group member shall be compensated according to the appropriate salary scale or salary structure for the individual's position. The reason why we added that particular language is because currently, everyone except for the superintendent is on some kind of a salary scale, including members of cabinet. Which means, as a member of cabinet, when a step is given, I get a step up to whatever the next designated dollar amount is, and I get the application of whatever percentage increase. We've given the superintendent now the flexibility, or you will be giving the superintendent the flexibility to take individuals off of a salary scale and do a different kind of salary structure approach. So to put it in context, down in our friends down in Montgomery County at the, I believe, associate superintendent level and above, those individuals are on what is effectively a year-to-year contract, where they are told, this year you're going to get this amount. And it comes in a memo that says the following positions will receive this amount, and they're all uniform. All the associate superintendents receive the same amount. We're not currently set up like that. I don't make the same as Dr. Sergo, who doesn't make the same as Ms. Claybaugh, who doesn't make the same as Dr. Leba. Like, we're all over the map on this salary scale, and this is going to allow, going forward, the superintendent to move towards a more unified structure for the cabinet level members.
And that is sort of separate from this policy, a project that I've been working on for about 6 months. And I just actually reviewed it yesterday with Dr. Dyson, and so it's going to be advancing to cabinet to talk to them about some of our revised approaches to how we're looking at that, just to line up with other LEAs in terms of our generalized approach. It won't affect the overwhelming majority of folks in the non-unit group. It is very specific to our sort of highest paid, highly compensated employees to sort of create a little bit more distance between the benefits of the blueprint that are intended for our teachers and some of our other staff that are, because of the way the policy is written, being automatically applied to our highest paid employees. And so when you give, what was it, I think one year we had 7% salary increase on top of a 4 last year, you know, on your highest paid employees, it's a significant amount. So this sort of sets the stage that allows that project to advance. And so that's why I've been waiting for this policy to come forward for me to then go back and share it with cabinet. They're aware that I'm working on it, and I didn't just drop the bomb on anybody. Yeah, so.
So, with your evaluation of this policy and this particular group, is there a reduction in the number of people that this covers?
Yes. Yes. So, and I don't want to set off any alarm bells for anyone, because when people have a certain feeling about which group they're included in.
Right.
But essentially, there's 124 people currently in this group. There's a certain number of them who will probably move into FACASA.
Okay.
They are supervisory individuals, whether they're certificated or not. We're just still working with FACASA on their plans to absorb these individuals.
Got it.
But again, that's why having the uniform benefits between here and FACASA is important, because it should have no impact on the employee, other than they'll have representation.
It's actually to their benefit.
It's to their benefit, to the members' benefit, and to the association. So there'll be some individuals who are supervisory, non-certificated. That FACASA is planning, we're just sort of still working with them on the infrastructure for that. But yes, there will be less people in this group. Well, who would remain in this group, of course, would be everyone currently on the executive staff, so all of our directors and above. But then there are some other folks, as you noted, who meet the definition of confidential or managerial. So I think like even most of our executive assistants would stay in this group, even though they're arguably in a sort of a clerical role because of the nature of what they do. Our attorneys will stay in this group, things of that nature. We haven't fully flushed out. We have this list, and we're constantly looking at it and talking about it and making sure that we have a good fit before we actually tell all the employees.
Yeah, there's certainly, I feel, justification for having people in the group that are outside of the bargaining units. I'd like to just revisit what you were talking about with the salary scale for those who, I'm not sure what you'll term the non-unit employee group, whether if they're cabinet executive staff. Do you feel that structure might affect retention?
The current structure we have or what we're looking
No,
at?
what you're looking at.
No, so everybody who's here is sort of grandfathered in. What I'm trying to do is set up a structure for the longevity of the system.
Okay.
And so there's a lot of practices that have happened over the last decade or more that demonstrate some variability in when people were hired, where they were placed, and things of that nature. So we're going to bring sort of, it's a future-focused planning project. It won't affect anyone who's here. We also did range finding with almost every other LEA to look at how they hire and place executive staff. We have access to everyone's salaries, so we've been able to sort of level set what that looks like. Most school systems don't have a salary scale for their executive staff. And I'm going to include sort of directors and above. They have sort of a base salary model. That base salary goes up. The employees in it still get raises, but it's not a step mentality, right? So, you know,
More merit than it is?
not really merit. No, it's not merit. That's sort of a not a word or term often used in public education.
Yeah.
But certainly, if you're asking what I'd say generally speaking, this policy allows a superintendent to differentiate how she would apply compensation. I will tell you it's interesting because I've been doing this project so deeply for the last 6 months. There are essentially 3 models for compensation in terms of salary increases that we see across the state. We see, first of all, the traditional model, a cost of living adjustment, right? Some sort of percentage on the base salary. The second model that we see is a flat dollar amount. So some school systems are doing a flat dollar amount. So, you know, I'm just averaging it out, if you look at a $100,000 salary and you say, I can either give somebody a 5% raise, which would be $5,000, or I can give them a $3,000 raise. So some school systems do a flat dollar amount to honor the contributions of their executive staff, but keep some of the costs in control. The third approach, which is one I wouldn't say is arguably that preferred, but there are some examples of it, is a deferred compensation model, where the school system takes the amount of money that they would have given onto a base salary and they pay into an employee 403B or something like that. The challenge of that is, number one, every employee has to have a 403B with the system for it to work. And number two, a lot of employees really prefer to decide what they do with their money.
I was
right?
going to say, that.
Right?
A little controlled.
Right, exactly. And so I would say that it's an option that exists, but I wouldn't say it's highly utilized. So this sets up the stage for the superintendent, based on the fiscal circumstances, to look at flat dollar amount, look at percent increase, but that the idea of going up a step, that mentality sort of goes, most school systems aren't doing that any longer. And so, you know, for me, I don't even know what step I'm on, right? So my salary goes up, it goes up. Whether I'm on step 5, 6, 7, or 8 is not as relevant. And at this level, when you're at an executive staff, it's not equates to your years of service anyway. So it's not like I'm on step 26 because I'm in my 26th year. So steps are more of a way of putting the total picture of compensation together, because most salary scales, there's a percentage difference between steps. So you say, oh, I'm going to give everybody a 3% cost of living adjustment and a step. Together, that's 5%. So it's not really necessary. We can just look at the percent increase overall. But again, I'm going way beyond the boundaries of what this is. I'm just sort of giving you a sense of some of the conversations that we're having around how to bring our approach in line with sort of a contemporary perspective of how these positions are treated.
Dr. Sergo and I had a lot of discussions about this last year during negotiations, and I think we talked in the hallway, we talked in negotiations, I really appreciate all the work that has already gone into just getting us where we need to be to do the real work. But I really appreciate the work you've done, particularly around number 3. Because I think it's important, like you mentioned, that we differentiate, particularly when we're negotiating in good faith with so I think this is great. So I really appreciate your hard work on this, and I'm excited for you to be able to move forward.
Thank you.
I had one more question, but I lost it, but we'll move on.
Sounds like ready to advance this to the board in the form in which it is without any edits required.
Yeah, there might, who knows, there might be some edits at the board level, but I
Yeah.
think we're ready.
Fantastic.
Great job.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So the next policy on the agenda, 1.07,
Oh, this is a quickie.
this should take us no time at all. It's new policy 118. This is a new number for us. Personal mobile devices, locally called the cell phone policy. We don't want to call it the cell phone policy because it actually needs to apply to more than just cell phones. My son was asking me yesterday, so when I get to middle school next year, are you going to buy me a phone because you said you were going to? And I said, no, I got you an Apple Watch and it does everything it needs to do. No. But that's why we're calling it a personal mobile device and not a cell phone policy, because his Apple Watch needs to be covered by it because it
Correct.
serves many of the same functions. So you know, obviously, we had the discussion back on September 25th when the policy committee last met. At the time, there was a lot of discussion about, well, do we kick this down the road and wait to see what the state does? Do we, go out and meet with stakeholders? But we had done a lot of that work already. Mr. Saunders is here to help support that conversation if needed. And so, as you requested, we came back with a policy drafted. And Dr. Sergo again took the lead. She and I worked together on this, but she took the lead. So I'm going to I'll let you walk us through it.
Sure, so listening to the conversation of the board, two things to keep in mind. Number one, this is in the 100 series because the takeaway from that meeting was that we really wanted, this wasn't just about our kids. This was actually also about our employees and about our visitors. And so the general policy purpose sort of captures that. And I tried to write it in such a way to say, we understand that these things are going to be in our lives, right? That we're all wired up. And so we recognize that there's a way of defining appropriate use, and we don't want this to interfere with learning. And that's sort of the spirit of this policy, is to establish what the boundaries are for that. And so you can see all of those definitions, which I think are mostly self-explanatory. In terms of implementation, the first thing is, of course, signaling the work that Mr. Falls and Mr. Saunders did, so it sort of directs immediately the superintendent to have a regulation and speaks to that. In terms of use guidelines, we have a statement here about the three groups that we're aiming to serve: students, staff, and visitors. That students have to have use that's limited. So it's sort of not a full-on restriction, but it should be limited use, and it should be aligned with developmental research and educational use. And so knowing that that's really the crux of the conversation. That staff, can't interfere with you doing your job. That's important. And of course, visitors, you have to meet both of those expectations in terms of the use. Overall, in terms of monitoring, I thought a lot about the conversation I heard when Mr. Saunders and Mr. Falls were presenting the regulation, particularly from our technology folks, about data privacy and about monitoring. And so what we basically said is, we're going to make sure our network is tight. When you're on our network, we can control that. We can't control what you're doing on your data plan, but we can control what you're doing on our network. And so we're going to basically make sure that our safeguards are there. But let us not be confused that if you're on our network, we can look and access anything that you're doing.
No expectation of privacy.
Correct, which is such a misnomer. In the HR world, we know this, right? But generally people think, oh, well, it's my computer or my phone. No. You're on our network. We have access to everything you're doing. And so we're being very clear about that. And that essentially in terms of how the conduct parts of it, we've got a code of conduct for students and for employees, and that visitors, we could bar you from coming onto our property. If you come on and you misuse your technology, you're taking videos of people, you're using it inappropriately to bully, harass, or intimidate anyone, we can remove your access to our facilities. In terms of safety and responsibility, this is one of the things that came up a lot, particularly from our employees, which is this idea of liability. If I take a phone or if I acquire a device because I'm using progressive discipline, what happens? Well, we're trying to say that we're assuming no responsibility for that. If the reason we have to take it from you is because you haven't followed our policy, we're not liable for your device, arguably. Again, about property and equipment, we acknowledge that we have filtering and other mechanisms in place to protect, and that, if you use your cellular network, so if somebody calls and says, my kid accessed an inappropriate website at school, and what are you going to do about it? If they're on the data network, we can't be responsible for what your kids are looking at, arguably. And so there's a whole bunch of stuff that goes on to that. In terms of item H, it's just I would like to call this not an complete, but an exhaustive list of all of the different places that this idea of appropriate use of technology shows up. That this is a sort of an umbrella policy and commitment, but in all these other places, we tell you, you can't use your personal mobile device to do any of these things. These are inappropriate and will not be tolerated. And so that's sort of where we landed, but you can see it as a long reference list because it's applicable in so many other places in terms of board policy. And I would offer my colleagues, Mr. Saunders or Mr. Falls, to elaborate or answer any questions on any items that I shared, but welcome to receive any other.
Two additional comments I'd like to make before we turn it over to Mr. Falls and Mr. Saunders. One, if you go back up to the definitions, we tried to craft a definition for acceptable personal mobile devices in a broad enough way that we wouldn't have to come back and revise the policy from year to year. Although which is my other point.
I did write that initially, but I thought that was probably not too much.
Well, we do actually have in there that this will have annual review. It's still in there.
Oh, it is still, you did, okay, I thought we were gonna take that.
We were
I think
going
that's
to.
good.
I had it in, and he's like, that's a lot.
Well, it's something I think we need to discuss, whether year to year or every other year. I mean, the challenge with year to year is we have a lot of policies that we're working through, and we're going to have to squeeze this in along with several others that do have a COMAR requirement or statutory requirement for annual review. So I think we do need to hear from the policy committee about whether you want to continue with that year-to-year approach. But the definition, we tried to write it in a way to say that it needs to be read expansively, because if you recall a few years back, there was a little bit of a push to the Facebook, I think, had glasses, or Google glasses.
Oh, geez.
They're back again.
Yeah, which they're coming back again.
Really?
And I don't know what the next thing's going to be. The optical, the VR headwear, that's not specifically addressed, but it should fall within it. And so we wanted to make it clear that we don't want to have to come back and say, oh, new technology, let's add it to the list.
Anything that's portable, anything that's mobile.
I mean, what's next? They're going to implant a chip in my arm that I can go like this and talk to my wrist, and that's not a watch. Right? We don't know what's coming because people are really smart and create lots of fun, interesting things. And we want this policy to have the flexibility to apply to those really fun and interesting things. So now I'll turn it over to the.
I think to reinforce that, who would have thought 25 years ago, when we were concerned about kids having pagers in schools,
Right.
that we would be where we are today with the technology? So that open-ended
Right.
definition, I think, is important. And I would recommend maybe that the policy say that it's going to be reviewed annually, maybe for the first couple years and thereafter, because I don't know that an annual review forever is necessary, because you always have the flexibility if we're seeing some dramatic change in technology to bring it back without it being part of the normal review process. So there are a couple grammatical things that I
No, please.
noticed that I think we could talk about, but I don't know if, Tom, if you have any
No.
comments about
There
content.
missed one Oxford comma.
Oh, my goodness.
I didn't pick that up.
Goodness.
But there was discussion,
There was one in the authorized use or unauthorized use, just a question around that is not explicitly allowed by a teacher or staff member. I don't know if we want it to be by any staff member. We want to leave it to just a teacher and an administrator. And I think it's in the definition of number 3.
Well, we could just stop at prohibited.
Yeah.
You could say that unauthorized use is if you're using this when it hasn't been permitted.
And the only reason is I think one of the concerns of the board was standardization. I think that gives some wiggle room, and I don't know if that's the
Yeah.
wiggle room we want to give.
Yeah, I think we should just stop as prohibited, because who prohibits it is almost irrelevant. It's not like, oh, well, this person said I could. If you're using it when you're not supposed to, that's what this is intended to govern. I think that makes a lot of sense.
well, and while you're there, I'll go ahead and jump to it. The number two. Number 2, I think, is where there's one of the grammatical things. Authorized use means use of personal. I think it should say use of personal to mirror
Yeah.
number 3.
Let me play devil's advocate and push back on the stopping at prohibited use and not taking Tom's suggestion of more clearly and narrowly defining it. The question, if we stop at prohibited use, is, well, who gets to make that decision? The policy doesn't say it's the administrator, it's the teacher, it's the counselor who's meeting with the student, or the speech pathologist, or whomever. I mean,
Isn't that in the regulation
In
though?
the
In
regulation.
the reg, yeah, in the reg, who gets to authorize use is in the
But I'm
reg.
yielding to that too. I'm not thinking necessarily about certificated staff. I'm thinking about staff who potentially trying to befriend kids. Say, oh, go ahead and
Like a
use
substitute.
substitute, or that's where I'm thinking. Not so much a counselor or.
Who is not as important, that's in the regulation.
Right.
I think the idea is that unauthorized use is using it when you're not supposed to.
I'm with you on that.
Period.
I think you spell it out in regs from there as to who has the authority to authorize use.
Right,
So you're gonna make a change and we're gonna stop at prohibited.
unless Mr. Blibus.
No, I was throwing it out there to play devil's advocate to have the conversation. I don't have
Yeah,
a
okay.
personal strong feeling either way. I just want to make sure that what we're doing provides the clarity that we know staff are going to be looking for.
Yeah, I think in the regulation it's there already.
Yes, I pulled it up because I really wanted to see how it was outlined in the regulation for elementary school students, for middle school students, and high school students, and I think it's pretty clear in the regulation. I would put it period at the end.
Other than a couple of the grammatical things, the one point I just want to make, because there has been discussion in the past, and then there also was, there were some comments, I think, made to the board publicly or in a previous presentation. I want to be clear, confiscation should not happen from teachers. That per our code of conduct, confiscation of a device happens at the administrative level. So that's a level 2 or above response, and that's admin that does that. So teachers should not be confiscating. So when we talk about confiscation in alignment with the code of conduct, that's an administrator that should confiscate, not a teacher. We don't want teachers in that
And
situation.
if you look, that was a tweak we made this year. That was actually brought up last year when we had the student code of conduct. And if you go in the student code of conduct in level 3, there's new language there that says confiscation and then a reflection. It says temporary confiscation, I think, of a device. And
Right.
level 3 is only administrators.
And that's why we wrote it in this way, because what's more likely to adjust and change over time is the code of conduct. You have to have a whole policy refinement. So it says, like, just do whatever the code of conduct says about confiscation, and that without explicitly saying what the code of conduct says.
But I think we're all in agreement that we don't want our teachers in that position.
No.
Because, if they take possession of that, do they have a way to secure it? Do they have a way to protect it? It's
Right.
not getting taken by another student, et cetera. So that shouldn't happen from teachers. And we
So are you suggesting that we spell out confiscation?
No, he's just pointing it out.
What I'm saying is that it refers to the code of conduct, and the code of conduct then provides that alignment. That confiscation happens by an administrator.
And I think one of the teachers that you heard present mentioned confiscation. And we just wanted to make sure you fully understood that while that might happen, that's not supposed to happen.
Right.
That's not in alignment with our code of
And we
conduct.
put it out there after I heard that, I had with the middle school principal chat, just remember, the only people, if there's something going on, call an administrator down to your classroom. Good news is we're really having less and less issues based on anecdotal information this fall because of the new regulation. So
So that doesn't, the teachers and the instructors, or staff member, whoever is in the classroom observing the violation of the policy, can instruct the student to
Oh,
place-
absolutely.
place the cell phone specifically, say, in their backpack or.
100%.
absolutely.
But that's not staff taking possession of it.
It's not like, give me your
That's giving
phone.
them
Give me your
instruction to
phone.
put it
But
away.
they can give them direction of where to place that phone.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And that's a level 1. So if you're looking at the student code of conduct, teacher control level 1 talks about telling a student to silence it, put it away, right? But within the same period, you could move them to level 2 if the person is non-compliant or insubordinate or whatever the case may be. And eventually, an administrator could be called down because this person is refusing to abide by the regulation. But the teacher has absolutely the control to say that it shouldn't be on, period, like in elementary. We shouldn't see it.
Right.
In middle school, we shouldn't see it. a teacher shouldn't see it in their classroom. So clearly they're in violation. High school, we shouldn't see it in a classroom, but there's a little bit more freedom because what we heard teachers say is they're dual enrollment. Some of the things that they need to get, messages sometimes need to come in, and so they're a little bit different level because of the reality of their life going to work or going to FCC or being part of other things that our network doesn't necessarily, provide. So
So that actually, I did have a question, and I was just gonna ask, like, are there times when a teacher will ask a student to use their personal device to access a site outside of what is permissible through, an
So-
school-issued device?
very rarely. I think in high school it's a little bit more, so the examples the teachers gave us were the student at the end of the period who wants to take a picture of a problem that was just worked out, or the assignment, a very complicated assignment, ask the teacher, can I take out my phone and take a picture of that? We're allowing that. In middle school and elementary, elementary, no. But that's the kind of use that would be permitted. And then in some of our arts classes, some of them are offering students the ability to privately or quietly listen to a symphony or something else. And that, yes, they can use the Chromebook, but we gave the discretion to the teacher for doing art. Can I use my phone as I'm doing the work, because I'm supposed to be doing it silent and individually? At the high school level, we're saying that is permissible, but because it supports the instructional program.
Mr. Saunders, I think also Ms. Allen is asking, so could a teacher say, go to this website, and the website.
That would be blocked by our network?
Yeah, so-
Yeah, that should not be happening.
They should not be using the device because we're providing them with a Chromebook.
And you're right, I was asking more
Got it.
of, something that would support the curriculum that was being presented.
Yeah, the only resources they should be giving students are resources that are appropriate for our network.
Yes.
They can't use their data to go around it.
Okay, that they have been given to support the curriculum that they're teaching, okay.
And while it might be a preference, there should be nothing going on in the classroom that requires a phone to be used. So in other words, I may prefer to access it, like I'm using the example of listening to something, the Chromebook can do that. So there's no reason that we are not providing, so equity issues and things like that. There's nothing that we are requiring a student to access. That there are multiple ways they could get there, but we are providing a Chromebook and saying this is our preferred method, but there may be a good reason for an exception.
Okay,
And an example that came up, I think, in our teacher group when we were talking is you might have a phys ed class where they're doing an activity where they're timing. And a student said, well, I can use my phone and set the timer. And so might be appropriate things that the device could be used for. However, if it's required or expected for instruction, we should be providing it, because not every student is going to have equal access to it otherwise.
okay, got it. Thank you.
So can I run through just a couple of the quick grammatical things that I think I picked up? Was D3D, internets, should be internet, I believe. D3D, internets, sites.
Polling the Bush term.
And then under H, we talk about audio and video recording of lectures or school activities. To me, that seems a little antiquated, because lectures, I hope, aren't happening a whole lot in public education, but maybe we say instruction, videoing of instruction or school activities. Just a grammatical thing that when I'm like, do we mean lectures or do we mean any instruction? They shouldn't be videoing instruction unbeknownst to.
I like that.
Audio, video recording of instructional activities, instructional or school activities.
Yeah.
Yes.
You got that one? Okay.
And those were the only other things. I think this is a great
I
policy.
really liked it.
Good, thank you.
Do you have any comments?
Now that we said it's great.
Yeah.
I'll remain cautiously optimistic, let's just say that. Because anecdotally, from a few, very few, and I hope it's just a few, I'm already hearing from a few teachers about the policy being applied.
In the regulation?
Yeah, the regulation being applied, not.
I think it's interesting.
Teacher down the hall is Right. I mean,
And those to me are local building issues that they have to address. Like, I think even if you had a restrictive policy, that was you're gonna still have those issues. So I don't know if it's as much a regulation or a policy as an implementation issue that has to be addressed with that administrator.
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I'm.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess
Because I see some, like, I have, not my role, but I see some things in the regulation that I don't particularly, like wording and application of it, I don't think is correct, but that's not my role. So that's really it. I look forward to hearing, say, whatever, spring, hearing from teachers in particular about how the first semester go, and getting some honest feedback from a lot of teachers about how they think it went. Because I just thought it was kind of amusing at the state conference.
Well, those were
Called
three
on
very
those
small
two,
districts.
but they called on those two students, thinking those two students were gonna give them a positive thing. Instead, the two students said, oh yeah, we have teachers that give us 10 minutes before class and
Right.
10 minutes at the end of class.
To use their, so.
Somebody goes, that's 20 minutes of your class.
Right, that did, so for
45-minute
context,
class.
for people listening, for context, we were at the Maryland Association of Boards of Ed conference at the beginning of October. Mr. Rose, Ms. Gallagher, Ms. Yoho, Mr. Bass, myself, and the superintendent. And there was a breakout session on cell phones, which was standing room only. And it was a presentation from three superintendents of three very small districts. And that's relevant, but it was Dorchester, Talbot, I think, was it Worcester or Somerset?
Yeah, one of the very small.
I mean, we're talking about two middle schools.
One or two high schools, one or two high schools.
Right, one high school. And they were using the pouches, the Yonder pouches, and so they were talking about that. It's hard to say it's not the comparison. But they had, the student members of the boards, including our own student member of the board, was in attendance at the conference. And so there were two student members of the board from one of the systems. I don't know if it was one of the ones
They
presenting.
weren't from one of the ones presenting, because the pouches you can't open, you can't open them.
Right, and they just talked about, their experience, because there were a lot of.
This particular policy that basically, I guess this was an agreement among superintendents within PZAM, because every superintendent I talked to at the conference was applying the identical policy that we are applying,
Right.
except those smaller ones that have decided to go with it.
Because they have it's a different.
I'm guessing PZAM,
Right.
they came together and said, hey, let's all do this together.
Yeah, I don't know that that's true, but I do think that they talk to each other about what they're
They
doing.
are virtually identical.
Yeah, well, because I think that's really,
It's not a bad, I'm not saying that's a bad thing, I'm just saying,
I think that's important. And
That's
sort of
where
an
these
indicator
students
of
came
where the
from.
conversation is across the
they
state. that-
came from this policy. And their
Yeah.
example was, oh yeah, it's working fine. We have teachers who let
Teachers give us
go
tech time.
10 minutes at the beginning of class and 10 minutes at the end.
And I think that is an issue that is consistent across the board with
Yeah.
other elements, dress code and the application of dress code.
Right.
And even propping a door open, because
Yeah.
it's hot. And those things require monitoring and accountability. And I think as we roll out our regulation, we're gonna hear of situations like that. It's up to us then to reinforce that with staff, to say, no, that's not okay. And over time, they will get to where they need to be, but all of them aren't gonna jump on board right away because we have a regulation on it. Because honestly, a lot of our teachers don't read the regulation. We do, parents often do. Teachers don't read our regulations very often. It's up to us to reinforce that with them.
And it's
Yeah.
about messaging too, and I think as the messaging went out at the beginning of the school year too, people were taking notice of this is sort of a new approach,
Yeah.
and there's accountability behind it, hopefully.
Yes. So I'm cautiously optimistic. I mean,
It is common in policy development to reach out to your peers to find out what's working for you, what's not working for you. I've had my colleagues reach out and say, hey, I know you've been working on this, can you send me your draft? And I will send it to them and say, this is a draft, it still has to be reviewed, I can't promise this is how it's gonna end up, but that is not an uncommon thing. I don't know that the heads get together and say, ha, let's all do this in unison. But it does end up, I think, when you have a good, well-developed policy, that the others say, hey, why should I recreate the wheel? You've done something really good here. We're going to import it. So I think that does happen frequently. And I think that will happen with our policy, because I think
if I was an administrator I would put this back on both my staff and my student. I would tell my student that this policy is being implemented and it's going to be up to you to adhere to it, because if you don't, there could be stricter policies coming.
And that's why we
Because
have.
I think that that's their personal responsibility, because that's the other thing I hear from teachers is they don't want to always be the police officers of their classroom over cell phones.
I would argue the mechanisms are there already. You don't need
They
a,
know they have that support. That's what I'm saying, that staff has to feel good about, like I use an example of a friend of mine that's an AP in Washington County. And he said at the beginning, they just knew at the beginning of the year, he was getting calls like one after the other to go to the classroom and take possession of it. But as now, it's not happening. Because they've gotten the message that he responds, that as soon as he gets the walkie-talkie call, I'm going to get your phone. And then the teacher, it just doesn't have to happen anymore because they know somebody's coming and going to take your phone.
and that's an implementation conversation. And I think as we continue to have those conversations with our administrators, we're going to reinforce that. That's what the code of conduct calls for. I don't know that there's a policy solution to that.
No, and I'm not even talking about Paul. I'm talking about in defense of what I'm hearing from some teachers, that we just need to ensure that our administrators, our principals, and our APs understand how key they are in the enforcement of this, and then that students hold a responsibility themselves. Because also, I flipped on this a little bit, that we, as an educational environment, have a responsibility to teach our students what is the proper use of your cell phone in a work environment. And so I think that's worthwhile as long as we can implement it and control it.
And that speaks to the work that Mr. Saunders and Mr. Falls did on the Student Code of Conduct and building into that the expectations on technology use, and the work that Dr. Sergo did on the Employee Code of Conduct that ties it in there, which is why we framed the consequences the way we did in the proposed policy that's in front of you, because that background work, Mr. Rose, that you're talking about has been done, and so we're ready to kind of tie all of those pieces together. I will say that if in a system of our size, which is not the largest, of course, in the state, but we are a very large system. If all you're hearing is a few instances of inconsistency, then I think that is a pretty good sign the regulation and the Student Code of Conduct and the Employee Code of Conduct are working.
That's my hope, is that it's only the few who are reaching out to me, or they're the only few who are reaching out to me. You know what I mean?
I think it's the
taking it
latter.
with a grain of salt.
And I think, but I also want to temper expectations for those who are watching or listening or however you're hearing this. If the expectation is 100% uniform implementation, that's never going to happen. It is impossible to have 100% uniform implementation. There's always going to be a little bit of deviation here or there. There's no policy or regulation that I could write that would guarantee 100%.
I think this is a good starting point, and
I agree.
we'll continue to evaluate it and get feedback and make sure that we're.
And I was just curious if I could, just really quickly, you don't need to reveal your sources, but was it a high school, middle school, or elementary? High school? Okay, because I'm just curious, because
You're good.
He's
Tom's like,
not
as long as it's not
responsible.
my school.
Very good, Tom.
I also was going to say, I hope you're encouraged, and I'm sure you are, for that person to reach out to their administrator, because they just may not know, and for that feedback. And I would also say teachers are in both camps as well. We have,
Yeah.
I think you and I were very surprised. We really thought teachers were going to say ban them.
Oh, yeah.
We honestly did, and that's kind of where we wanted to restrict them, right, as best we could. That's not what the high school teachers were sharing with us, in particular. Other teachers were elementary was clear from the beginning. We don't want them, we don't need them. Middle school, upper grades were kind of saying, well, this is how we're using them. But we were really surprised that high school teachers really, to your point, it's a tool that they need to know how to use and learn in a good digital citizenship way. It's a tool for work, et cetera, and that was a really powerful argument.
Yeah.
So
When we,
No, I'm excited that we're, because I was disappointed as a parent. I was disappointed that FCPS kind of got caught. They dropped the ball, because when my son was in high school, 2009 to 2012, the flip phone era, I went to school and picked up his phone multiple times, because they were strict in high school. Back in 2009 to 2012, if you had your flip phone out, it was confiscated.
Yeah.
And so somewhere between 12 and last year,
Pandemic, I think, was a big
we relaxed, and it became,
I think that was part of it, but also what the technology can do transformed in that time. And so therefore, there were more educators who saw the value of kids being able to.
yeah, I think we
utilize them.
mixed up the value and
And as a result,
It ran amok.
we went too little. Exactly,
Yeah.
yeah, I agree with that, and I think.
and
where-
probably pre one-to-one device.
Correct.
So,
Where we're landing, I believe, is a really healthy place, and like you said, we're gonna need to monitor that. But my concern going into this work was that I expected teachers to say, we don't want any. And if the board took that position, I expected the opposition you were gonna hear was from parents who need to be connected to their child during the day. And I think where we're landing is really a good balance of saying, look, there are appropriate uses, but by and large, they're not used appropriately at school, and we need to rein that in.
yeah, they won me over in that regard, as I want to see how it works, because I was a hardliner at first. And then I did read some articles about, don't we have a responsibility as well as an educational spectrum to teach our children? How do you use this technology in a work environment? And schools are a work environment, so how do we teach them so we, part of career and college ready?
Yeah.
So it sounds
So
like.
thank you.
With some minor tweaks, some grammatical corrections, the addition of an Oxford comma. This is ready to move forward to the board.
I think so. And I appreciate the quick work to pull it all together. Really, this was from our board meeting to now, to put it together into the format with the definitions and everything. I think it's broad enough and narrow enough that it's clear where we stand, and we partner up with the regulations. So thank you for the work you did to put it together, and I think it's ready for the board.
I did start with ChatGPT and asked it to write a policy for us, just to
That's
see
not
what
what you
would
want.
happen. Honestly, it
was
wasn't.
similar. He was
It wasn't,
checking
it
my
wasn't
work.
I
bad.
thought you yelled Sergo when you, Sergo. Please write me later.
He's like, this looks pretty good. I ran it through ChatGPT.
He doesn't say, hey Siri, he says, hey Siri.
What ChatGPT came up with wasn't bad, but it was more a regulation than a policy.
Okay.
From the way we use the terms.
Yeah, that was funny.
I'm gonna start that. Hey Saunders.
There'll be silence.
Sorry, I don't understand.
All right.
Try again later.
So the next policy on the agenda, 1.08, is policy 417, alternative education services, home and hospital teaching and incarcerated students. This is a new to the policy committee policy. It is for information and discussion, so our staff can get information about how you might want this to be changed. As you can see from it, it is a very brief document. It was adopted in 2006 and revised in 2019, so it's been 5 years, and it's ripe for review again. And Dana, I'll let you and your team, I'll turn it over to you all.
I want to start with an introduction of Karina. If you don't know Karina Novus, Karina is one of our PPWs, and Karina, as one of her roles as a PPW, coordinates the home and hospital teaching. So I asked her to join us for this because she lives this, and whatever the board discusses, I'd like her lens on that. Secondly, of course, Janet's back here, and I always listen to Janet. But one of the things that Janet pointed out to me, which as soon as she did, I'm like, that makes perfect sense. We need to change the title.
I agree. I was just gonna
Please.
say that.
We
Let's,
should not be calling out incarcerated students in a title of a policy.
or even home and hospital.
Right, and so Janet's recommendation was that we call it alternative education services. We might cover that in regulation or even in the policy to define, but beyond that, I don't think we should be calling out our incarcerated students. So I don't know, Karina, if you have any comments that you'd like to start with before we kind of turn it over to you to give us your input. Obviously, this needs completely reformatted in definitions and purpose statement and all of that. But Karina, is there anything that you'd like to share up front?
There is, and thanks for the introduction, Dana. It's nice to see everyone. So again, this is a very, very brief policy, but I just had a couple minor suggestions. Under policy statement A, it says students who, due to health needs, I wondered if we wanted to insert the word verified, because there is eligibility paperwork that's required from the student's medical provider who recommends it.
Can we just say students who are eligible?
Or you can just say students who are unable to attend their regular school program.
I kind of like verified, or, because I don't want this to get with our VP discussion, that, you know.
Well, and quite frankly, if we approve HHT, there's really narrow criteria that a doctor has to recommend, or an appropriate treating for mental health, somebody who's qualified to make that recommendation.
So maybe under definitions, there might be something in the definitions that
Yeah.
could qualify.
Yeah, where we
An
either
individual.
certified or
Yeah.
approved or.
Yeah, okay. And then just, it also talks about that they're entitled to receive instruction through home and hospital. I wondered if we wanted to, instead of the word entitled, indicate that they are eligible to receive home and hospital instruction. The vast majority of our students who are approved for home and hospital engage in those services, but occasionally we have students that we offer those services to who aren't actively engaged, and that becomes an issue. So it just worries me that we're entitled to provide it, but if we're given a situation where a student's not engaging over a long period of time, we have to address that. And then my only other suggestion under B and C, this policy doesn't mention anything about our students who are incarcerated at the adult detention center. So I just want to propose under B and C, just adding an additional sentence that says students who are incarcerated at the Frederick County Adult Detention Center receive educational services through the FCPS Department of Student Services, because we coordinate a one-on-one teaching situation for those students at that facility.
It mirrors HHT, but without medical documentation.
And same
I
thing
think
under
it's
C.
verified a different way.
Yeah.
Yeah. So is it fair to say, just sort of when I'm thinking about this idea of the title, alternate education services. In this definition, we provide alternate education services through home and hospital or services to students who are incarcerated. Those are the two groups that are eligible for what this policy defines as alternate, right? No other groups. Correct, okay.
So the alternative education can be because you're approved for HHT or because you're.
Right, so it's about the eligibility, and I just think as Nikki is also working this up and thinking about sort of the working with you all, it's really through those definitions, like, this is what we mean by alternate education, this is what we mean by eligibility, and these are the two settings in which this applies.
Right, two student groups.
And that's accurate, there is no other
There's really three student groups.
alternative
Yeah.
education options within FCPS that we consider.
I want to be careful.
That's why I'm asking.
Right, that's,
Because I would, and again, looking at that lens, I would almost prefer that we call it student services instruction. Because this is instruction that happens through our office. There is alternative education.
That's why I
Heather
agree.
Ridge is a phenomenal alternative and I don't want people not to see alternative means different.
Correct.
Not a punishment, not a, it's a different setting that provides for student needs in a different way. And so,
Maybe that should be one of the definitions.
Or the policy should be called alternative student services.
What alternative means is that it's providing in an appropriate setting, instructional setting.
Well, except that the opportunities to receive alternative education through Heather Ridge are very different than what the law spells out for juvenile services education or for home and hospital teaching. And so I'd want to keep this policy to that focus. I just think if we change it to student services instruction or something like that, don't even call it alternative.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Get rid of the word alternative.
When this is brought back, with
I would say
the edits,
free range for
whoever, whether it's Mr. Falls or
Brainstorm that.
someone's going to be able to explain, here's how we got to this this title. This is how we came to this conclusion. We heard what you all said. This is what here's how we got here. I don't want us to get too far into the weeds here, because that's not really the purpose of this conversation. It's really more about gathering what your interests are, so that they have an idea of how should we propose and edit this to make sure we're.
Mr. Falls,
Yeah,
all
we
of this
would
is
go.
codified in COMAR, correct? Like, so we're, essentially, the policy is restating language and definitions that exist elsewhere.
Yep, pretty much. Yeah.
One other thing that I think might be important to consider in the policy from our perspective would be how we're transitioning students back into regular education from these placements too. So like as a board, we want to support students from their transition back from juvenile services or from incarceration or from hospital as well. And so some policy statement about that successful transition, which I'm sure we're doing, but I don't see
For instance,
statement in here about that commitment.
students who return to us from juvenile services, for instance, we have a formalized process where it's a collaborative meeting with the parents and DJS and our school staff, myself. I chair those transition meetings and then determine what does the student need to transition successfully, and then where can we provide those services depending on what they need.
So I'd like to see some.
That's a good idea, yeah.
So for the Heather Ridge School though, where is there a policy that talks about Heather Ridge? Or a regulation that talks about Heather Ridge, or is that more of an internal?
Well, it's an option. It's not really even a placement, because we don't place students there through special education generally. Those are voluntary transitions, or what we call superintendent transfer, where the parent requests that in lieu of a disciplinary removal. And so, but no, there's no policy on the alternative education, and not every school system even has a robust alternative option in the way that we do.
Right.
And that's why I want to kind of keep it out of here, because that is something that we invest heavily as a school system in students that are struggling emotionally, behaviorally through Heather Ridge. And that is something that I wouldn't want people to see there's some entitlement to it, or that, hey, I'm eligible for that, I demand that my child goes there. Well, no, these services are required for us to provide. And so I'd like to keep this clean in regard to what this policy is.
It makes sense.
So I think.
Anything else that you would want us to address in this as we kind of revise this completely?
Do you have a companion regulation, Mr. Falls?
I'm sorry?
Do you have a companion
Yeah,
regulation?
there are regulations for home and hospital teaching.
What is it,
So
437?
that talks about the process.
I'm sorry.
Oh, that's 400-37 and
It does not get into the
400-93.
transition process for DJS though. Yeah.
This is an anchor to those regulations.
Yes.
It didn't, okay, got it.
Become 41701 and 41702.
Gotcha.
I love my numbering system.
I know you do.
No, I like the suggestions that you are making, and look forward to seeing it in our template.
Well, so I don't know, I know we have very full agendas already scheduled for November, and there is no December and January. So this, I mean, Ms. Chesney and I will work on whether this is possible to get this on in November, but I don't know if we're trying to keep us at no more than 5 to 6 in a session, because 2 hours is a long time, but there's a lot of robust discussion. And I'm also trying to keep the policy committee from getting too far ahead of the board. Because the board is only able to hear what we do every meeting, and we build up a giant backlog if this committee moves too quickly.
Is there any rush to,
I was gonna say, I don't see a sense of urgency with this, because our regulations and our processes are very clear, and I assure you are in alignment with COMAR.
Okay.
I promise you that, so.
it's a small set of students, right? It's not,
This is not about politics, just a question about, is there any, I'm assuming it's controlled by COMAR, is there a discussion about expansion of the services? Because aren't there just, isn't it a limited number of hours? It's not a,
Home and hospital.
So the limit is the minimal number of hours. There is no maximum limit. And so we are required minimally to provide 6 hours per week of instruction.
per week.
Per week, that's through COMAR. Depending on the student needs, would determine whether we exceed that or not.
So we're extremely flexible with those few students that we have on this.
Well, we have a lot of students on HHT. The DJS placements are
Right.
minimal, but we have a lot of students on
So there
HHT.
could be any number of range from 2 hours, 3 times a week to every day, more hours.
Well,
Is that-
our standard
Within
is-
our staffing, how we're able to.
Our standard is 6 hours a week. And again, depending on the student needs, we might go more than that. And typically, Karina reaches out to me when she feels like, hey, we need to provide more hours than what are required. And then we work together on that, because we do have to stay within budget too.
Yeah.
Take pride in that we operate within the budget, so, but we are flexible to the needs of the individual students.
And be aware of our resources.
Yeah.
that we have with teachers
Right.
and their availability, but yeah.
And the vast majority of
Our
our
own staff.
HHT right now are being done virtually.
Gotcha. Right.
And that actually is more favorable to families than I expected it would be coming out of COVID.
Yeah.
But we do have some students with needs that require face-to-face. And we have others that, just due to the family situation, we really need to push that in person. So they're done at
And is the
public
majority, transitional? Or we're just transitioning them back into the classroom? Are there students
So
who
the goal is
remain
always,
in home and health?
I mean, the
for a
goal
period?
is always to get them back. It's a short-term instructional service. So these are kids with underlying physical health, emotional health conditions, actively recovering or getting treatment. So the goal is always to transition them back to
we
school.
need to state that too in the
Well,
policy.
but we do have students who have chronic conditions,
Yeah, but we,
terminal conditions at
Right.
times, where it's not transitional, it's long-term because of their little
Well, maybe that could be
legitimacy.
two definitions.
yeah.
That could be
just
two
gonna say that,
definitions.
Two definitions.
So for instance,
And
for social, emotional, mental health, our requirement is that it does not exceed 60 days, and that if there's a need to and there's a transition plan developed when we approve it.
Okay.
We've really tightened that down.
and that's the kind of stuff that would be in regulation. That's all.
Exactly.
So,
Exactly.
okay. Okay. Thanks. I just had a side question there while we had you.
I think then we'll target February's policy committee meeting. That should give you all plenty of time to.
For which
work
one?
on February. Whatever it's always the second board meeting of the month, so whatever.
Things are functioning well and we won't rush it.
Right, and so that brings us to the last policy we have on the agenda for today. Policy 436, school-sponsored publications and media student journals. This is another information and discussion only, bringing it to the panel for feedback to staff. Good morning. Mr. Murphy is here to take notes for staff on what it is the panel is looking to see in any edits. This was adopted in 1986. It was revised in 2016, so 8 years. It's another longer in the tooth policy and probably overdue for some update and revision. Mr. Murphy, is there anything you want to share before we ask the panel to tell us what they'd like to see?
I think it's kind of stands for itself in terms of the current state, in terms of always wanting to empower students to have a voice, particularly through publications that happen within the school system. Identifying areas where, we want to ensure clear guidelines for students on what may be inappropriate or outside the guidelines of what we want published within the school community. This policy does give the principal kind of the final say on if there is a concern to review it and make a decision of whether something can or cannot be published, which I think aligns to existing practice, and certainly my own experience as a high school principal, having to navigate, sometimes students want to publish things that may be outside the lines. And so this is, I think, a good reflection of the current state, but we certainly want to hear from you on your interests.
I have a couple questions. So have the regulations, or I'm sorry, the COMAR regs been updated since then, or are they still applicable to this?
So I don't know that there is a COMAR regulation. There are two education code, which is the statute.
Okay.
So I don't know the answer to whether those have been updated since 2016.
I didn't look. So
Yeah, and neither have I. But certainly as part of that work that we will do in making revisions, my team will go through the law and make sure that any changes in the law are reflected appropriately.
And then it looks like the definitions here are referencing this Black's Law Dictionary.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I don't know if that's still applicable.
I don't even,
So Black's Law Dictionary is like the Webster's Dictionary for lawyers. It is the dictionary that lawyers turn to for this kind of thing. But I mean, really, what we should be looking at is what is the Supreme Court saying about what does it mean or how are things defined? Because Black's Law Dictionary is just a compilation of definitions, whereas the Supreme Court is interpreting the law for us. So we
Yeah, I
do need
was
to do
just
some
gonna
more
say,
there.
we may wanna look at that to update the definition, I'm not opposed to keeping those particular terms, libel, obscenity, publication, that in there, just the definition. And then I had another one. So it says, school-sponsored media does not include material that is intended for distribution or transmission solely in the classroom in which the material is produced. Why is that an exception to this?
I think it's because it's governed by the other policy. It's governed by the instructional materials policy, right?
If it's something that teachers is using for curriculum instruction, it would be governed by 500 and the companion regulation with 500. This, going back in time, 1986 and revised. This could also be, one of those situations
Going back
where
in time.
students are doing some creative writing in class and sharing their pieces.
That's what
with
I
each
thought
other.
of was,
Okay, all right. I'm just wondering if we need to be expand upon that.
1986, the definitions from 1986. That says everything.
I feel like that's a bad song or something.
I know.
The definitions are almost certainly from 1986 because the definition of publication doesn't reference the internet, social media, online bulletin boards, AOL. I mean,
There was an alarming
all
lack of mention of social media. Yes, we saw that.
My first thought was, do kids know what a magazine is?
And we do have the social media. We address social media in other policy, but
We need to include newsletter in there.
Do they know what a photograph is?
Yeah.
Have you seen an actual one that you touch?
it doesn't even mention video.
Yeah.
It's a photograph.
Mr. Murphy has such diplomacy, but I think you're generously saying this has to be overhauled.
You can bring it up to the.
I didn't have a lot. I'm just like, this thing needs to be way,
Rule 24.
Let's bring it
Some
up.
of the, but again, some of the concepts are still the same.
Yeah, they're timeless. They're timeless. They're timeless concepts.
first section applies. The rest of it kind of, yeah.
So when we do talk about the publications, I do think that there needs to be also like defining what the student publication might be. So is that a student newsletter?
Right, I was
Is
thinking it
it-
was probably a newspaper, right?
Yeah,
Yeah,
or
it's their student
newsletter
newsletter,
or something that they go out with on whether it becomes a periodical in the library or whether it becomes, distributed, how it's.
Yeah, you bring up an
distributed
interesting
too.
point. So, like, I'm wondering, you made me think about like yearbooks. Like, I'm assuming that's not meant to cover this, but,
It actually does.
Oh, it does? Okay, interesting. So, like, a typical publication is like a yearbook, a
There are-
newsletter, or newspaper,
Yeah.
right?
Oftentimes, schools will have literary journals.
Oh, right,
that
okay,
students
okay.
produce. The big ones are the student-produced newspapers that now have online editions. Yeah.
Right.
The yearbooks, often literary journals that happen as an extension of English classes or after-school clubs.
I know the morning announcements have gotten a little more creative at some of the schools where they're
I think we're doing, like,
quick news show almost.
Well, they do like, yeah, my children's elementary school does that. They have, Gator News every
Yeah,
morning.
every morning, real quick.
Yeah.
Oh,
The news of the
Yeah,
morning.
news show, like little, and, whether they're internal or they go on YouTube, we have some, it'd be interesting. There's some interesting stuff here.
Well, and not to beat the point up, but Scott, Mr. Murphy mentioned, that these literary magazines are now living online. That expands the scope of the audience. When I was in high school, which was like 1,000 years ago, it feels, the student newspaper was handed to me as a physical piece of paper. And nobody outside of my school, except for maybe a few parents, would have ever even looked at it. Now, those publications disseminated worldwide.
Well,
Google and
right.
generative AI make everything findable.
Well, a lot of our schools are putting things on, social media. They have their own Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, whatever it might be. So, interesting.
Well, and you'll see the policy also, Section B does address privacy. When students are writing, they're also often writing about their experiences with peers or their experience with a sports team. And so when we now get into the realm of social media, the issues around privacy, we also need to be paying
And
attention.
use of photographs and likeness and things like that, names, things like that.
And AI fakes.
Oh, really?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's not directly the same, but there was the whole incident up in Baltimore where an administrator was suspended because
Oh,
an
that I read about.
upset parent created.
No, it was a coach.
A coach. It was an upset coach created a
AI of his
fake
voice.
AI of his voice saying things that were inappropriate. The same could happen in pictures generated for an online student newspaper,
Sadly.
where pictures can be generated
Scary.
through AI to depict people doing whatever. So, I think there's a lot of real cutting edge change that needs to happen.
No pressure or anything.
No regulation that accompanies actually.
In terms, well, I'm glad you brought that up, because my question was, given that this is so long and some of this reads regulatory,
Yeah.
are we going to do a shortened policy, 436, and develop a 436 regulation?
Is there a regulation?
There is not a companion
No.
regulation on this.
Yeah, there's not
Some
one.
of this is regulatory language.
Yeah, and then, because I was looking here at, a student
just
media
randomly
advisor is
middle.
charged with teaching the professional standards of English and
Yeah,
journalism.
that's regulation language.
Yeah, I feel like that's probably more of the how-to, not the why.
So I think we wanted to just start by hearing your interests around that,
Yeah.
regarding really what should be more regulation versus the board's policy. So that, I think, helps us drive some next steps.
Like you've got some good writing to do.
Yeah.
This is definitely one for February.
How about
You're not having this
how
ready
about
by
March?
November.
Yeah, March maybe.
March, yeah.
If
Because
that
we're
is,
at budget, that's like January, February.
Yeah, let's
That's
March it.
like-
yeah, I'm sure Mr. Murphy's appreciative of having an extra 30 days.
Yeah.
28 days.
Thank you.
By then, we've submitted our budget to the county executive and
More.
And then we're just waiting.
Lots of time to think about.
That's right.
So that, well, unless there's other comments from Mr. Murphy, that brings us to the end of the agenda. Chesney, do we know what's on for next month?
I was gonna say, if we have an idea for what's.
For November.
For the board, or are you talking about for us?
For us.
For us.
It's November
So 418, which is the child abuse and neglect. And then we also have fire drills for information discussion, transportation of students for information and discussion. And that's all I have right now.
Is there anything in the queue that is supposed to come back here, do you know?
Just
Other than
418.
418.
4 and 8, okay.
We have caught
Okay.
up with those. I mean, honestly, I'm okay with a short agenda.
That actually may be the opportunity for a brief November, nothing in December, and
And
then
then January,
an opportunity to catch up.
in January.
A lot will come back to us.
Possible. It's in, so, I mean, for example, we have tonight on the board's agenda, the charter policy and for a second
So you need
reading.
space for something to come back here.
And we have the library material selection policy for a
Oh,
first
yeah, yeah.
reading. Both of those could end up getting kicked back. It's entirely possible to policy committee, and so having that,
I like especially at the end of the year here to be a little lighter.
Can you tell me the numbers for fire drills and transportation of students?
410 and 441.
441. Thank you. All right.
Great.
We had transportation
We've been having a lot of conversation about transportation during budget talk, about expanding this, how far.
That could be.
Because we actually had a public speaker come here when we were talking about it during the budget.
But the policy itself has not come
Yeah.
up. I mean, it's not come up for review.
When's the last time that's been reviewed? 'Cause I feel like we looked at that, but maybe I'm wrong.
I will also say the next meeting may be the last meeting with this iteration of the panel.
It's
Oh, that's
Because
true.
December will have new board members and new committee assignments, so whether the panel looks the same.
You don't keep your committee assignment through the end of the school year? Just at the moment of, okay.
well, because we'll have
Calendar year.
We'll have 3 new.
Oh,
board
yeah, you have to make room for it.
regardless of what
Transportation of students was last updated on March 23rd of 2022.
happens. Yeah, so
Okay.
we would have looked at it,
Yeah.
Yeah,
right?
but it's coming,
March of 2022.
No, we
Here.
weren't in yet.
and it's coming back now because it's a part of the.
Just,
board.
like I said, it just came up because we mentioned in budget about maybe adding another quarter mile, so that got everybody like,
Yeah,
Right.
that's
right.
true. We looked
Yeah.
at it because of that budget
Yes.
discussion. You're right. We didn't
Yes.
make any edits.
Okay.
All right, thank you. So, we're adjourned.
Thank you.
thank you.
All right.